The Borderlands series is showing its age. It's been 10 years since any big leaps in innovation, and the cracks are starting to show. Copying the lightning in a bottle that was Borderlands 2 isn't cutting it anymore. The writing, story, quest design, everything that isn't the moment-to-moment combat, character builds, or voice acting is sorely lacking. And this all became readily apparent on my recent playthrough of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. Borderlands is a great game series, held back by some very dated systems. Before I jump into the bad, I want to acknowledge some great changes made with this game specifically that put it above Borderlands 3 in terms of gameplay. Wonderlands reworked the melee combat system and added melee weapons, which is a welcome change due to how useless melee attacks were in previous games unless you completely spec'd into them, and even then, they still paled in comparison to other builds. I think the system still needs some polishing. The swings and hits don't feel quite right. They lack impact and feel floaty, especially when compared to something like Vermintide. The lock-on is also really aggressive, and it would be nice to have an option to disable it so I have more control while swinging. This is still miles better than any of the other Borderlands games, and is sure to make melee-only builds much more engaging and less tedious, with having actual weapons to use with different swing speeds and effects like lifesteal or cooldown reduction on hit. Wonderlands also introduced attributes and multi-classing, both adding a lot of depth to build crafting. There's 6 classes in this game compared to the usual 4, the downside being that each class only has 1 skill tree as opposed to the 3 that have been present in all of the other games. However, you can mix and match any of the classes together for a total of 15 class combinations. And as far as I'm concerned, for the other games you only ever really spec'd into 1 or 2 of the skill trees, so there isn't much loss from only having 1 tree per class. Makes each class more focused on their specific niche. The action skills in this game are also the best that there's been overall. However, I don't think anything will ever beat the sheer enjoyment of gunzerking. There's some really novel and fun skills in this. Fade Away is a returning favorite from Borderlands 3. Then there's the Grave Warden's Reaper of Bones skill that heals you to full HP and gives you lifesteal and dark magic damage, but drains exponentially more HP until you would die, at which point you go immune for a brief period. And finally, my favorite, a deceptively simple action skill, letting the player equip a second spell in place of an action skill. Now, what are spells? Spells are what grenades were in previous games, but with a change that is my favorite addition in the entire series. It changed grenades from a limited consumable to an infinite use cooldown based system, which is a godsend for me, and I'm sure it is for many other players who suffer from the hoard every consumable you have forever because you wouldn't want to waste it syndrome. I'm now gonna go on a tangent because I hate consumables in games, and unless I'm mistaken, it isn't that hard to fix the issue. Games like Dishonored originally had a mana system that you needed to refill with potions. Now, you'd regen a fixed amount after each spell, but some spells costed more than what was refunded, which in turn told my gamer brain never to use those spells and to only use the ones I could get a full refund on, because I didn't want to waste those oh so precious mana potions. In the latest Dishonored game, Death of the Outsider, they changed to a charge system. You have 3 spell charges, and the spells use the charges, and each charge regenerates 1 by 1 over time. Mana potions still exist and refill the charges without having to wait, allowing players to still chain together spells like their StealthGamerBR, if they wish. This system allowed for so much more freedom and experimentation, and with games like Skyrim with all the filters, I think a good solution is how Witcher handled it, by having potions be permanent consumables that you have forever with a fixed amount of charges or uses, which refilled when you meditated or rested. This could also tie into alchemy for Skyrim, letting players strengthen these draughts and filters, having them be long-term rewards that players use throughout their playthrough. Long story short, I had the gamer disorder with Borderlands grenades because you had a limited amount. With the change to spells that have cooldowns, it encourages the player to use it as much as possible instead of hoarding and worrying about wasting ammo. These are really big improvements to the series. And of course, there's other things that are more subjective. Personally, I think the world's art design is far and away the best there's been in the series, with some really gorgeous vistas and diverse locations. Bosses also seem more intricate than previous games, and some have some pretty cool mechanics that require you to jump or dodge. More mechanics than just simply shooting at the boss until they die. These changes are all notable and make build crafting and combat more engaging and fun. But those were already the series' strongest aspects, and I'm not saying they should have improved other areas of the game instead. It's just sad to see the rest of the game straying so far behind, holding the game back from its true potential. Destiny 2 is a game that had a lot of problems, and still does, with time gating. Time gating is locking off content behind a timer of sorts, and it gets in the way of having fun. The most notorious example was the Thunderlord exotic quest, which was originally hyped up, only for the player base to be disappointed that the quest dragged out for 3 weeks before you could obtain the gun. Similar to Destiny's time gating, Borderlands has what I call a dialogue gating problem. The writing and the way the story is presented get in the way of having fun playing the game. In Borderlands, you spend what feels like half of your playthrough forced listening to others talk for minutes on end before being able to progress, with no option to skip the dialogue. Doing a side quest? Get ready to stand around and listen to quest givers blabber on in between each step. There desperately needs to be a better way to deliver the story to players, because the current method repeatedly pulls the player out of the action and gameplay, especially on subsequent playthroughs. And for what? Borderlands isn't a particularly story-focused series, except for Tales of the Borderlands. The first game's story is unknown to most that have played it. The gameplay comes first, and the story takes a backseat. But recently, it's been feeling like the story and dialogue are bloating, taking up much more real estate than they should be, given how little of actual substance is delivered to the player. There's multiple ways in my eyes to fix this bloat issue. By far the easiest would be to have a skip option for dialogue.
Bearer, seek, lest.
Letting players who are not interested in it just skip over everything completely and just get to the gameplay. Outriders had this, and it's something that should always be an option. I know Gearbox may not want people just skipping all the dialogue they worked hard on, but players should always have a choice. Another option is to give the player the dialogue while they're doing the quest steps. Some quests already do this, and I don't think it would be too hard to get many others to this style as well. Or you could have quests end and then have dialogue afterwards that you can stick around and listen to if you wish. Destiny 2, for example, gives almost all of its dialogue while you're out in the field on a mission or afterwards. It doesn't make you sit and listen to a briefing for each quest before you start. And speaking of Destiny 2, there's a very large and substantial lore community that is very passionate about the story, even though its story and writing are very backloaded, whereas Borderlands is very front-loaded. With Destiny, this helps to keep players from getting overwhelmed with story details and plot points, and then, if the player is interested, there's a vast amount of lore that they can dive into with lore books and lore tabs on items. Borderlands is the opposite. It front-loads all that writing and dialogue onto the player at once, and then there's nothing to dive into further afterwards. Now, I'm not saying Borderlands needs lore cards or lore books, but it would be nice to have an option of asking to learn more about quest topics. So if you want to know more, you can, and then if you'd rather not and just speed through, then there's a lot less dialogue to sift through. And finally, there's just a lot of talking in these games. Too much, in my opinion. It seems Gearbox has gone for a more quantity instead of quality approach, which is hurting the pace and flow. The dialogue needs to be trimmed down, and I think very easily 20 or 30% of all the dialogue can be cut out, with nothing of value being lost. Now, onto the story itself. I think the overall story is incredibly basic, which isn't a bad thing at all, since it's basically just a D&D session and it follows a rather simple, cliché plot that most sessions follow. But just because the structure is simple, doesn't mean you can add a ton of depth to the story. Lord of the Rings is about some people trying to travel to a volcano to destroy an evil ring. Now if you know anything about Lord of the Rings, you know that's a gross simplification, but in essence, that's what it is about in its simplest form. Wonderlands is about your group of heroes defeating the big bad villain. This time, however, that isn't a gross simplification, or really a simplification at all. The story is incredibly bare bones, and the characters themselves don't bolster it either. The vast majority of the characters you meet are complete one-offs. You go to a new region, you meet them, they make you do something for them, and then that's it, and you'll never see them again. For something like side quests, this is acceptable, but this happens many times in the main story, which makes it hard to care about anyone because you know they're just gonna drop off the face of the earth once you're done with their region. You could have recruited all these people for some super team to assault the Dragon King's fortress in some big battle. I think that's probably the easiest way to incorporate these characters past their spot in the spotlight. It's frustrating because I can see through the murky water what the story was supposed to be about. Diving into Tina's insecurities and abandonment issues with a villain that has a lot of potential with him realizing that he's in a game. I can see these things, but they feel half-baked and bogged down with purposeless clutter. The story needs sharpening and honing on what's important, and to cut away all the excess. And then you'd be left with a poignant story that has a lot of impact. The Dragon Lord has potential, but he just feels distant, and it makes me wonder if Gearbox doesn't know what made Handsome Jack a compelling and engaging villain. It's not the insults or jokes. I think the biggest thing is that the conflict with him felt intimate. He got close to every important part of the story, and he's close with the player. Things got personal between you two.
You get the hell away from my door!
Bandit, if you keep this up, I'm heading down there to blow your brains out myself! You hear me? This is my vow. Every friend, every child, every person you've ever passed on the street, I'm gonna kill them all.
He was also dangerous and cunning, outsmarting the player and their group multiple times in the story, and his killing of a major character feels 100 times more impactful than Tyreen and Troy killing Maya, which didn't really feel earned, and also had a major problem with the player character not existing in that cutscene. With Wonderlands, the Dragon Lord kills Butt Stallion almost right away, and it seems rushed and it lacks any impact, and it failed to grip me in any meaningful way. And then he just basically disappears until the end of the game, only occasionally making jokes and insults instead of being an active part of the plot. Those are my overall big issues with the game, and the series. There's other things more specific to this game, gameplay-wise, I think could do with some improvements. I don't remember this being an issue in 3, maybe it was, but the enemy density seems incredibly low. I feel like there could easily be double the amount of mobs to fight during combat arenas, fodder or otherwise. The density seemed so low that it made builds that relied on chaining kills or constantly damaging enemies hard to use, because I felt like half of combat was me running around looking far and wide for my next enemy. The new loot luck system is another problem I have with this game, big problem. Loot luck in itself is a terrible idea for any game in my opinion, and I've never seen a valid reason for it to be a mechanic in anything. Because if it actually affects loot in a meaningful way, it will just become a must-have stat, basically punishing anyone that doesn't have it. And that's how the loot luck dice feel in Borderlands. They don't feel like a reward for exploring, they feel like a much too numerous collectible that you're punished for not finding, because your quality of loot will be objectively lower. The chaos chamber is also something I'm not sold on. It being an endgame randomized dungeon activity with challenges and unique bosses is cool, but I struggle to see how it will succeed long term, because in the end, no matter how random it is, it's still a repetitive activity and concept. And with the Chaos Chamber being the only endgame content in the game, it doesn't leave a lot to make players want to come back. I like the Borderlands series. The first game was a pretty big part of my childhood and shaped a lot of my thinking surrounding video games. And I want the series to be the best it can be, which I don't think it's achieving currently. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Let me know down in the comments how you feel about this series. And yeah, that's gonna do it for me. Hope you guys have a good one. See you later.